so much you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time.
Welcome to Is It Bad for the Economy, the podcast where we explore whether Trump's policies are helping, hurting, or just a load of hot air. But today we're going to talk a little bit about housing with our good friend, Teg Vercetti. My name's Kobe Tyree, Democratic media consultant, trying to figure out how the Democrats can finally get the credit they deserve for outperforming Republicans on the economy for my entire lifetime. And keeping me honest is the anonymous financial practitioner, Banker Bill, who's doing some phenomenal work at a bank you've definitely heard of. And like I said, I'm glad to be finally joined by Teg Vercetti. Tegvir, I'm really glad to have you on because I've always felt like you've been a kindred spirit in the sense that you've always been very attracted to, gotten really involved with politics on the far left, but at the same time had a lot of capitalists in your life, tried to balance the divide, trying to keep what's exciting about both sides going. And the fact that you are now in affordable housing development, essentially trying to bridge that gap in practice in a way that's really impacting things on the ground, I think is really cool and interesting. And I'm so excited to talk more about that just because, again, I think that it makes a lot of sense to me that that's what you're doing right now. Banker Bill has wanted to do another in-depth housing episode for a very long time, especially talking a little bit more about New York. And I've been putting it off because I'm not from New York. I don't know anything about New York housing, but that's why I was so excited to have you on. One theme that's so interesting to me about this, especially as we've talked about the abundance thing and also New York and Zoran's policies, is this idea that any sort of rent freezes on the top end completely nullify any sort of incentive to build on the back end. And the new mayor in New York, Mayor Mamdani, has essentially tried to do both of those things at the same time, talked about things like rent freezes on the front end, but also tried to backload the agenda with a lot of pro-development, pro-building opportunities. And of course, the big one is the rail yard project that he just went down to Washington, D.C. and pitched to Trump with those amazing newspaper covers. I just love the fact that he's trying to do both, working on the buy-in as opposed to letting the contradiction get in the way. People like Banker Bill frustrated by that. I like the way that he's trying to navigate that. So I want to learn a little bit more about what you're doing to navigate that. And in a perfect world, what could the public give you? What could the government give you that would let you go out and build as much affordable housing as possible?
I'm Teg Sethi. I started a company called Spatial Equity in 2020. We're just starting our second project now in New York City, which is 193 units of affordable and supportive housing. Primarily, my focus has been on supportive housing thus far, which is housing for people with disabilities, mental illness, or some issue. The first two projects have been focused primarily on women and their families who have a history in the justice system. Reentry is one of the names for that population. And with that comes also people with mental illness or people with substance use disorders, people who typically fall into the category of chronically homeless or homeless. And supportive housing has generally been a focus on homelessness reduction, housing first, providing people with an apartment and optional voluntary services, I should say, rather than mandatory commitment as a way to permanently reduce homelessness. So, should we start with the top with the question about rent freezes?
I'll just back up. You say you define supportive for supportive housing. What does affordable housing mean?
Affordable housing for me, it means housing with a low rent, housing that working class and below people can afford.
Is that a number or is that a percentage of income? How are you thinking about it?
I generally define it as things that are 60 or 80% of area median income or below. In New York City, that's around $80,000 to $90,000 for a household of two or three and below. I think the most recent area median income for New York City is pretty high. It's like 130,000 is 100% of AMI. But generally, I come from the nonprofit world before this, and we tried to focus a lot on trying to provide housing for people earning in the 30% of AMI to 60% of AMI range. So that's generally rents between $500 and $1,500 a month.
And what's a unit like that look like? Tell us about the build, the size, fixtures.
It's interesting. These buildings cost a lot of money. Part of that is due to a lot of regulations on what they have to be. But at the same time, their finishes are never that fancy. We try to make our finishes a little nicer, frankly, but it's quartz countertops, it's stainless steel appliances. There's no washer dryers in unit. We're trying to put dishwashers in now more. But the apartments they're nice. They're new construction. They're nice product. They're concrete. They're good buildings.
So your target is $80,000 household incomes in an area where household income is typically $130,000 for the median.
80,000 and below.
Got it.
Supportive housing, a lot of people are not working. They receive rental subsidy.
Sure. Right. For the various reasons that you described.
Yeah.
So on rent stabilization, why stabilize rent instead of just building more units with Tegvir?
I don't think those two things are related in any way, shape, or form. You know, I just don't. They're just not related at all. I don't know where to start. How do you see them as related? Maybe we should start there.
Well, I think as a general matter, if you have these rent stabilized units or you cap the rent increases, by default, you're going to reduce the amount of investment into units of that type and the existing unit. The constraint in New York is it's a desirable place to live. People want to move there. It's very dense, but it could be more dense. And so you touched on regulation, but beyond the regulation is just oftentimes an unwillingness to build additional housing units, even if it's very costly. You hear these things that, they want to build, say, 100 units and maybe they're going to cost $800,000 a piece. Well, ultimately, even though they're expensive, it's actually worse because the development actually never gets built and you're getting no units. So I actually think there has to be some kind of middle ground between capping rent and stymieing future investment and also greenlighting projects to increase density where people want it and need it.
Yeah. So New York is an as of right development city. There's no like site plan approvals. Typically, there are rezonings, but most land is as of right. Sometimes people make a big issue of approvals, but typically most land is developable. And as they've done a lot of neighborhood-wide rezonings over the past 10 to 15 years since the Bloomberg administration with the Olympic bid, the rapid rezonings of various areas, there has been plenty of available density to develop in neighborhoods that people want to live in and in neighborhoods that that are less attractive. I think what I think you're talking about is correlation between rent growth and rent and attracting capital towards that investment, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, we want more investment in housing in New York. Your units that you're working on building, are those rent stabilized?
They're all rent stabilized.
Okay.
So when we talk about rent stabilization, we're talking about very specific types of housing, which is new subsidized housing and housing that was constructed prior to 1976. Everything between those two is not rent stabilized unless it has received subsidy. And so the nature of subsidy is typically that you are replacing the fact that there is no private capital that would invest into that yield. And I think that's a really key thing to realize. So when you're investing in real estate, there's two parts of that investment, right? There's the rent, there's the return, the base return, and there's the growth on that rent. And so when you talk about rent stabilization, what you're talking about is a severe cap on the growth of that rent, right? You're talking about, frankly, like what most people think of as the upside of real estate investment, which is that it's like an inflation hedge, that when you cap rent stabilization and you apply rent stabilization, that you have lost that inflation hedge entirely. And inflation has now become like a weakness for you.
It eliminates or reduces one of the incentives of investing in real estate. Sure.
Exactly. Yeah, because usually for large private equity and large capital, real estate is seen as an inflation hedge. And as a result, you're seeing in New York City in the free market stock, huge amounts of rent growth. People are paying crazy rents right now in New York City, and rents that I could never have imagined even 10 years ago when New York City was already expensive. People paying $13,000 a month to live in a 3-bedroom, rents that people normally buy houses at.
Do you think that the market rents are in part so high because they are, for lack of a better phrase, a subsidy for the subsidized housing or affordable housing?
How so?
So if all housing were market housing, except the supportive housing, right? Any of those kind of situations, wouldn't all market rate housing be lower? Because we've added now to the market, open market supply, all of this formerly rent stabilized, right?
So,
you see what I'm saying? You have
no,
low
yeah,
end of rent stabilization is very high in the market.
yeah.
And if you add more to the market supply, right, you would eventually end up towards an average or a median for all.
Yeah, I think that this type of logic is what a lot of people would argue is the downside of rent stabilization, is that it is artificially increasing the rents by constraining supply and rents on available supply. They did this in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They abolished rent stabilization in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it did not have the impact of reducing rent whatsoever. In fact, it had the impact of increasing capital investment, which is what some people would say is a good thing. We've improved housing stock, but it did not reduce rent. If you look at it deeper, you might argue that by creating an attractive investment for people, that you actually created further follow-on gentrification in neighborhoods even surrounding Cambridge. So I would say that I think that the idea that housing and housing developers and landlords are operating in a liquid commodities market and that all housing to some degree is equal, it demonstrates a lack of any knowledge that housing is like any other product that people produce in America. It has a lot of different types. So let's talk about the idea of deregulating rent stabilized housing in New York City, for example. Most rent stabilized housing in New York City is very different from luxury housing. Now, there is an impact, and they talk about this in the urban planning world and urban studies world as up filtering and down filtering of housing stock, which is the idea that as there's a lot of demand for housing stock, that you'll see, let's say, Class B housing stock, like a lot of rent stabilized housing stock, be up filtered. The idea is that where once it was $1,200 a month and a family earning $60,000 a year could afford it, now it's going to be $1,800 a month. And it's still going to be the same quality housing stock, but that B class housing stock is never going to be the $12,000 housing stock. It's just never going to be. It doesn't have an elevator. It's not in the area you want it to be. It's an old building. It has like the shitty steam radiators that like knock all the time. It's a very different
I
style.
think that's okay. That level of housing is very important to have
Well,
these different layers.
I think a joke I've heard, Tag, that gets at this idea is that if you want affordable housing, you should build luxury housing 20 years ago.
That's the down filtering argument, right?
Right.
That's what people saw in New York City in like the 90s when they were getting their Soho lofts for like $600 a month that are now renting for 20,000 when there was a severe lack of demand and you saw like really nice spaces. And Soho loft is a bad example because I was industrial, but there was nice housing stock in Central Park West or the Upper West Side that was really, really nice in the 1940s and 50s that in post-industrial New York was now cheap and now like high-end housing stock was accessible to low-income people, right? That's the down filtering side of this. Now, what I think rent stabilization does is prevent up filtering of housing stock, and it creates a greater surge of demand in the higher end of housing stock. But it does not do anything for people in the middle and lower. And the fact of the matter is, you know, if you're a banker, you know that capital has its own will as well. Capital doesn't just flow based on where there's yield. It flows based on comparing yields. And that has a lot to do with interest rates. It has a lot to do with where in the market cycle we are and things like that. And the fact is that the yields that people want on building new construction housing, especially in a post 2008 more regulated banking environment, is just never going to produce housing for working class people. No matter if the land is free, no matter if there's no regulation whatsoever, in New York City, it's never going to produce it. A lot of that might be regulation related. We have terrible insurance laws in New York City. We have a very strict building code, a very progressive building code that's focused a lot on sustainability and reducing things. We have a lot of rules around fire that they don't have in like Texas, where we try to prevent them and they don't. There's a lot of different rules in New York City that make it more expensive to do things.
You know, can you pick one of them and expand a bit more?
What's your least favorite one?
My least favorite is insurance, for sure.
And that was the first one you mentioned.
The others I kind of understand.
Okay. So this one, which you kind of don't.
I mean, I understand politically, but I don't
Sure.
understand.
But as someone who's in there building this and has to obviously comply with it, what upsets you about it?
It doesn't just affect builders, it affects everyone in New York City. But what upsets me about New York City's insurance laws is that there are huge payouts. It's just that the personal injury and injury law firm world of New York City is like nothing you've ever seen. Top dog laws on every single billboard and every single bus, and they wouldn't be doing that if they weren't minting money, you know? We have specific laws in New York that don't exist in any other state. And a lot of that has to do with the politics and the Democratic Party within New York as well. Insurance is a huge driver of operating costs for buildings, a huge driver of auto insurance costs for people as well. If you bump someone, you're going to get a lawsuit and they're going to go to your insurance. The mindset in New York is it's okay that I'm suing you for bumping me at 2 miles an hour. It's just your insurance company that's paying. It's not like I'm suing you. I'm just getting money from your insurance company. It's no big deal. Like it's normal in New York for someone to fall, like your friend, to have a fall at your house and sue you and say it's not personal. It's just you have an insurance policy. So like, why wouldn't I get that free money, you know? And it's not them, it's the lawyers and the whole legal industry that's pushing that. So that has a huge impact on costs in New York City. It's very hard to do business in New York City as a result because it's very hard to get insurance. It's very costly to get insurance to do a lot of work in New York City. So there's a lot of barriers to entry as a result of that.
This is very sticky and increase your transactions cost. So that increase your cost to build and ultimately flows down to the bottom line of ultimately who pays for that is the end renter, no matter if that's a subsidized unit or a market unit. To what extent do you think, if at all, does New York's labor laws and the pressure on rents there apply pressure in the surrounding communities?
I think that it's why you have seen an incredible amount of growth in New Jersey that you haven't seen in New York. Jersey City, acting as the sixth borough of New York, has done more for New York's housing production and for middle income people than almost I think anywhere in New York City, possibly.
And they have one of these pro-build mayors there in Jersey City.
It was the mayors before that who were providing a lot of tax exemptions for builders.
And that's what then flowed through to the ultimate housing that we see now.
I would say that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But also you start to see that the difference between New Jersey and New York is, it's a lot of the same contractors, but in New Jersey, it's much easier to do this construction work. You don't need the same kind of insurance coverage that you do in New York. It's very challenging to work in New York as a result. So you have a lot more competition, which reduces costs significantly. I would say New Jersey's costs are around 50% lower than New York.
30 to 50% lower.
Yep. And it's the same building.
And so if that's mostly insurance, is that a problem that could be solved on the city level or on the state level?
I think it's a state issue. You have to realize that there are so many gatekeepers to work. And when I say work, I mean as a business owner. And I think that it applies to the subsidized world and it applies to the market world. The other difference between New Jersey and New York is that New York City is the land of institutional capital. It is big money. Every piece of land you buy is like $7 to $50 million. In New Jersey, you can buy a piece of land for like $1 to $2 million. It's just a different treatment. The types of banks who are involved, the types of investors who are involved have a different class and appreciation for risk. So from a builder and developer standpoint, much easier to get funding because they're willing to take more construction risk because it's just a different class of investment. Whereas in New York City, it's all big banks, big investors. They have zero interest in any risk. That means the pool of people who can do it are very limited. It's a very tight pool. It's a handful of builders who are allowed to do this. And that has the biggest impact on cost. And so from the insurance side and for subcontractors, it has the same impact. In New Jersey, you can get a simple insurance policy and do work. Anybody can go in there and start doing concrete work because none of this stuff is rocket science. We've been doing it for thousands of years, literally. Concrete has been being poured since the Romans. It has been happening for thousands of years. You didn't need a big back of house. You didn't need any of that. In New York, you really do. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to get insurance in New York. In New Jersey, it's a couple $1,000s. It has a huge impact on the barriers to entry, which allows you a lot more competition and allows you a lot more source for labor and work. And that's what I think people miss when they talk about pro-build policies, is they still think that things are just an economics 101 problem to solve. And I think that is like a lot of the problem we have with the modern Democratic Party is we really believe that policymakers can just solve this with the right regulation or the right this or the right that. And they forget that policies don't build housing directly. People build housing. Like businesses go out there and build housing. And so you're right to think about what are the yields and incentives for businesses to develop it. But you're wrong to think that it's just a matter of calibrating those incentives sometimes. It's much more than that. It doesn't just come down to the incentive for the individual. It comes down to the incentive for the capital that chases that individual, that chases that opportunity. And they're very different. So that's like, I think, the fundamental difference between places like New York and New Jersey. It's regulation, but it's also the nature of that capital.
I think that's a really interesting point because when we talk about the housing crisis on a national level, the thing that always comes up is that this is really concentrated to a tiny amount of counties.
68 out of about 3,300.
I think the point that you're making about New York there is so interesting that when you have that much wealth concentrated in that much of an area, just the league of financing that you are talking about when it comes to building a skyscraper, because you are in the top league in the entire world when it comes to building those kinds of fundamentally financing and insuring those kinds of projects, that there is just simply a cost, a rigidity to operating on those scales just by nature of the fact that it is so in demand to live in that place. It is going to be harder to build more there.
Yeah, and it's not just about it being a skyscraper or not. You could be building a two-family house in New York. It's just the types of people who are investing in it and who aren't. It's who's in the market, which capital is in the market. That really drives everything. I can't stress it enough. Like, it's not supply and demand economics 101 stuff that's driving everything. It's about what is the capital in that market. Like, when we talk about the biggest creation of workforce housing in New York City history, you don't talk about like who was the builder of Rego Park, which was Real Good Construction or whatever it is. That's why it's called Rego Park. It was the insurance companies that funded it. That's who was driving that investment because they were looking for a stable yield or whatever it was that they were looking for. And they funded Stuytown and like thousands of units of market housing in New York because that's what they were focused on, this opportunity of how are we going to house post-war boom. They saw a market opportunity for that and they went for it with that type of capital. But that's not the capital that's in the market anymore.
So talk about the capital that is in the market. What's the capital that wants to invest in New York real estate?
I think it could still be institutional type investors like insurance companies or whatever, but it's very limited to they only want the most proven people because there's too much money at stake.
In terms of development.
In terms of developers, in terms of builders, in terms of everything, there's too much money at stake. There's too much liability. And so it's a different type of investor. So there is in New York happening a ton of building for lower income people right now. It's not very attractive housing. There's a lot of corners cut, and it's being done in the Bronx and East Brooklyn and Jamaica and poorer neighborhoods. And what they're building is housing for voucher holders. And this has happened ever since the 80s. These people will build the cheapest housing you can build under the code. There's a lot of things, a lot of corners cut, but they are masters at navigating this and are able to achieve a return. And they're doing it because the barriers are lower. They have their own financing sources. They are not your big national banks or your big private equity investors. They're themselves. My family built a lot of market rates since the 90s and they self-fund. So the capital barrier is enough that you can self-fund. Whereas most development in New York City requires limited partners, requires private equity. It's just completely different. And those types of partners are never building housing for working people. They're only building high return, high yield investment. And so there's no room for risk. They have a big credit committee that is really focused on everything that can go wrong. They're in the risk world, not in the business world. And it's two different things. So there are people though who are building that voucher housing right now. They're doing it and they're doing it fast and they're doing it cheap. And they're all chasing the fact that the city has a huge amount of city FEPS vouchers available that are unused. There's a demand there and they're making it happen because the barriers are low.
And that's all rental housing?
Rental housing.
What motivated you to get into this part of the development side of things in New York? Is it that you saw a genuine market opportunity here, a business opportunity here? Is it because you were interested in making this kind of a difference, this kind of an impact on the ground, some kind of combination of the two?
I had a fashion brand out of college, as you know, and I shut it down. My family was in real estate. While I was shutting it down and trying to figure out what I was going to do next, my father asked me to go get this certificate to know like the basics of real estate at NYU. Said he'd pay for it, and I was like, all right, it's like a 6-month program or it's like a 1-semester thing. I had to learn finance.
Oh, no.
I studied poetry and film, so finance was new for me. But I went to this event about affordable housing and saw these people talking, and it was like someone from like Wells Fargo and like a developer dude and some other nonprofit person. And I was just like, this is a cool business, you know? This is a cool world where you can help people. And it's like a very collegiate environment. It's like a small industry of people who generally have like their hearts in the right place. And it's all low income housing tax credit related development. So it's subsidized development. And it's just like a really terrific community. And I had that little eureka moment where I was like, wow, maybe this could be great. Like I could do this thing and I can help the poorest of the poor people. At the time, I sort of had lucked into living in a rent stabilized apartment. It rented it as a market rate. It turns out the landlord was doing a lot of fraud and it was actually rent stabilized. And I sort of discovered this incredible experience of what it's like to pay a reasonable rent and have a community of people who don't have to move out. And there's a lot of problems with it, but I realize that like being able to pay a reasonable rent is like real freedom, It's like you can be anything in your life if you're paying a reasonable rent. You don't have to reach your highest and best economic potential to survive in New York City.
Sure. And reasonable to you would be,
To me personally,
yeah, as you're defining it here when you're talking about reasonable.
if I could earn, 70 grand and still live, that would be pretty cool, as a single person. For me, that was reasonable, and that was what I was able to do because I found an apartment that ended up being like $1,700 a month, which was a lot, but it was my own place. It was a studio. It was a really cool studio across from a garbage dump. But like, that was reasonable. I could
Yeah,
say
that sounds fair. So you're at like 1750 a month if you're making 70 grand a year. It's $21,000 a year, 30% of your income. It's the high end, but yeah, unfortunately you don't own, you're just renting in perpetuity. But yeah, I agree with that. That's reasonable.
I didn't save any money when I was earning 66 grand a year and living,
Sure, it's hard.
but I felt like I could go live and get a job earning 66 to 80 grand very easily anywhere. And so I was always going to be okay. I didn't have that like sense of insecurity, So it's a powerful thing. So I went to this event. I was like, this is great. Let's do this. So then I transferred into the master's program and took a lot of courses at Wagner and went after that.
In a perfect world, would there be 100 more people doing what you're doing, or would they all be focused on different parts of the equation?
Yeah, I think there would be 100 more people doing what I'm doing in a perfect world. Yeah. I think there's so much room for people if there was the capital there for them too. So the capital's the hard part.
And where have you found the capital for your project?
To come from a rich family makes a big fucking difference. To be able to be a developer without a real estate history. So being able to refer to the fact that my family's been doing this since the 90s, even if it's market rate, is a huge difference, You can't just get into it on your own anymore. It didn't start that way. The affordable housing industry in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s, you could get into this without that history, without that track record. But that changed.
And that's because the financial institutions that we've been talking about are more likely to work with you specifically?
I think there are a lot of requirements that you have to hit now to be able to develop this type of housing. There's not really an appetite for risk in it anymore, It's become, I think, as we've tried to drive down yields and up pricing on tax credit investors, one thing that went with that was the removal of a risk premium entirely. You have to have shown you've already done it to be able to do it for the first time, which means that you had to have already done it for the first time to be in this world right now. So
A lot of recent graduates understand that problem.
yeah.
Sure. The exact type of people who would benefit from this type of housing. So Teg, people listen to this, they really like what you're saying, they want to be involved. How do they learn more?
The nonprofit I developed my first two projects with is called Housing Plus Solutions. They're a leader in this type of housing for women who have experienced incarceration. I'm developing a project right now with Community Access as one of the first organizations focused on deinstitutionalization and providing supportive and community integrated housing for people with mental illness. And my next project's with Volunteers of America, which is one of the largest and oldest providers of housing and shelter for homeless people in New York City and the whole country. Those were three great groups. And those groups are doing this, and they fund a lot of things that they don't get paid back for through any grant, and they're bridging a lot of things, and they can always use support. The dollars that are donated to them multiply in incredible ways, and they can go on to produce thousands of units of housing.
That's awesome. We'll go dig up some links and include those in the show notes. We've been talking a lot about New York City stuff, and that's exactly why we had you on. Thank you so much. I can't even begin to tell you how glad I am to have you say a lot of the things that you've been saying, because A, I know they're true when you say them. I'd be just guessing. But B, you also know all the fancy words, because this Econ 101 supply and demand just couldn't be the whole story when it came to something this complex. But we talk about the national picture, though. Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to solve this problem from the federal level? Are there any plans that you like? Are there any things that the federal government could do that would make your life a lot easier?
I think when you're developing subsidized housing, you start to resent all of the work you have to do to receive that money. When you're getting federal money, it comes with prevailing wage requirements that are frustrating or risky or scary. It comes with environmental review things that are difficult. I try really hard not to cry about things like that. I think that it's public money and it's coming with public policy implications on that side. That's all I'll say about how federal money and stuff like that can work.
Looking at it from that perspective makes a lot of sense to me. But is there a thing that a presidential candidate could put on their platform and you'd be like, hell yeah? Is there like one positive thing that the federal government could do right now that you think would either make a difference for the housing you're trying to build or just housing in general?
I think that if the federal government created, and they have this in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to some degree, a public banking and financial option for investment and financing for the development of housing that set the market, then I think that that would make an incredible impact on housing production around the country, but especially in New York. I really think that we spend too long trying to focus on the smaller picture of policies and systems with the idea that those are the things that are stopping us, and not enough focused on the fact that it is capital that drives everything in capitalism. And I think without focusing on that capital, you are missing the entire picture, because there is an economics 101 argument in housing. It's just not about the supply and demand of housing stock. It's about the supply and demand of capital. So I think anything that the federal government could do to focus on that and understand and focus on the supply and demand of capital, not just to the production of single family homes, because they do that really well. We are famously like the best country at supplying capital to single family homes through mortgage insurance products and things like that. Created the 30-year mortgage, like all of these things. We're amazing at home ownership, but really, really terrible at housing the working class.
I mean, it sounds to me like essentially what you're saying is that capital is going to build the types of real estate projects that capital wants to build. And that's going to be the result of a decision that's so complicated and to a certain extent so subjective that just trying to pass one policy on any level may or may not make a difference.
It will not change the picture. It will just drive up or down yields in a way that probably won't create the kind of seismic shift that we probably need to produce the amount of housing that we need.
In a lot of ways, though, wouldn't the answer to that be like, okay, so we need to stop focusing on policy and we just need to start coming up with really great projects and have the government directly pitch those to institutional investors? Would that be a better way of going about it?
Perhaps. I mean, perhaps there's a way the government can enter into the world of construction and development risk.
What about through municipal investments such as roads, sewage, water hookup, utilities, etc.? Bring all that in under municipal bond issuance. Take it out of the developer's hand. It's all paid for. They'll bring it all in.
That's already done in New York City. We have all the infrastructure in place.
And outside?
Outside of New York City, it is a part of the development process that comes with a lot of time, frankly. It can cost years of time sometimes. And that is a big difference, right? But I, again, don't think that that is going to be the seismic shift that people are really looking for. And I'll tell you why. What you're talking about when you're talking about municipals and you're talking about utilities and you're talking about that, you're talking about an impact on yield, ultimately. You're talking about an impact on your ability to realize a return soon after your investment, which is a timing yield and a cost yield. So what you're really saying is the reason we're not producing housing due to yield only, or is it due to availability of capital? And some capital might make itself available when yields are a little bit better, but I don't think that's the core issue. I mean, because the issue I've been talking about, and I want to focus it a little bit, is the idea of producing enough housing for working class people in the country. You know, I'm not talking about people who are homeless, who require direct subsidy or whatever. I'm talking about people who are working class.
We talk about them a lot, the middle 80 of incomes.
It almost sounds to me like you're saying that people who are trying to solve this on the policy side are like the zookeepers who are trying to create the perfect environment for the pandas to mate. And you're saying like, no, we just need to go find some horny pandas.
Exactly. Yeah. Or
Exactly.
we need to
Sure,
get
yeah.
some pandas horny is really what we should do.
Hey, talking about big swing solutions that's been in the news lately, we had the Senate bill that passed this idea that there's too many large scale investment operations that are owning single family homes. A lot of serious policy people keep saying, look, it might be 3%. That's not what's making the difference here. Definitely not nationally. Other people are saying it's just a good idea to get these sort of incentives out of the residential market. How do you feel about that particular debate?
I don't know enough about the single family market to
Gotcha.
say that it is going to make or not make a big impact. I think that the attempt is to say that we should reduce some of the demand from certain types of investors into a type of housing stock, and that will help make it more affordable. It has the unfortunate impact, my understanding is, of adding an additional paperwork requirement to closing a house sale now. It's like a FinCEN requirement now that like now all the lawyers and title companies and everyone can like freak out about every time they close a sale now.
It's a new transaction cost, you're saying.
It's
It's a new
action cost.
compliance cost. It's a new
Yeah,
page. Yeah.
yeah. And I think in general I'm against most of those,
Sure.
So
Essential
but
theme of the show.
sorry.
No, we're against them too.
Okay.
Too many of these policies are written sort of in a similar vein to what you're saying of like, this sounds good on paper. And at the end of the day, the outcome of whether a policy is a good idea or not is going to come down to, are the people who are implementing this policy day in and day out going to be incentivized to do a good job, or are they just going to do the bare minimum? And this sounds like, unfortunately, we're getting a little bit closer to the latter.
Or is this going to make it harder for new people who want to get into the world of implementing that policy to be able to do that policy? Unfortunately, I think compliance burdens tend to have really just act as a barrier to entry. Like I think if you see the explosion of the tech center in America, right? It had almost so much to do with how deregulated it was, but then how all of those tech companies are very focused on now regulating out their future competition. So I think it has the same impact of institutional players tending to regulate out their competition. But
We were talking a little bit about the Queens project earlier that Mamdani was personally pitching to Trump. Do you have any strong opinions on that one? It sounded like it was interesting, but sort of intricate and expensive.
yeah, I think it's smart because Mamdani believes in the creation of union jobs. There's an economic development. I think, all affordable housing programs and all public investment programs really started as a jobs program, like the development of public housing and things like that were almost all jobs programs first and foremost, and kind of housing programs after the fact. They're infrastructure development, a
That's
job.
super interesting.
And that's probably kind of part of the flaw of like why things went pretty bad, because they were like, let's just build this stuff. It's really great. Let's build a lot of jobs. And union jobs are, even though a lot of them in New York tend to be held by Republicans who live on Long Island, like they are really well paying jobs and a road to the middle class. And the unions always need more work in New York City and New York. So I think this is a way for the mayor to create more jobs. Federal money comes with those requirements. The economics will never make sense, but that's not what it's about, right? It's about Mamdani being able to access additional money that he can't access and just make the pool bigger, right? He's like, this is the resources I have in this mayoralty. How can I do more? When you asked me, like, why am I doing low income housing, like affordable subsidized development? There's only a certain amount of subsidy the city has, and municipal bonds and tax exempt bonds and low income housing tax credits they can issue every year. And it's full every single year. So that is fixed. How do you make the pool bigger? It's stuff like this. You got a president who really wants to do some big stuff, and you got unions who want jobs, and you got a way to build a lot of housing and do something exciting and make the pool bigger. It's no different from any other big infrastructure project like Gateway and everything else that may have happened. But to me, it makes a lot of sense from if I'm the mayor, why I would do this.
Well, we hope Trump approves it. We would love to finally give him a W. We tried to give him a W for the State of the Union. It completely went
Why are you bringing
splat in
that
our
up again?
faces. So no, we're dying to at least put something in the W category, because this has been a pretty lopsided podcast.
I will say though that it's an easy W
Right.
that he is making.
What's something that you wish normal people understood when they're trying to figure out what to make of these affordable housing headlines in the newspapers, and when they're trying to vote for the candidate that's better on housing?
There's two things. One is I'm always on my soapbox about this we got to abandon this economics 101 nonsense around supply and demand of housing. Like you just gotta. Well, the longer we do that, we're just like really buying into like the trickle down Reaganomics that underlie our entire industry.
And your primary drivers of that are like regulatory, insurance driven, capital driven.
What I would replace with the supply and demand argument, you're saying?
Right, right.
What I would replace with the supply and demand argument is a much more nuanced view on it, where you're focused on different housing typologies and how there are different things affecting them. And you have to focus, like, if I want to incentivize more high-end luxury development, I do one thing. If I want to incentivize more working class development, I do a different thing. If I want to incentivize more single-family housing, I do a different thing. There's a whole world of things you do for different things. It isn't just produce more, get more, etc., you know? And the second part of it is you have to understand what it actually means to build this housing. So part of it is, yeah, like reducing regulatory barriers and compliance barriers that prevent people from entering into this world of being a part of it, and increase the cost as well, you know? And the second is like getting funded. Those are the two big things, right? Doing the work and getting funded to do the work. Those apply to everything. But then my second thing, if you want to understand the policy implications of housing development, you should talk to people who are in housing development, you know? When I was deciding between Zoran or Cuomo or anyone, I was not really fazed by any of the choices as being game changing in any way whatsoever. So if you had asked me, I would have said, it's going to be great either way. It's going to be fine.
Well, I appreciate you saying that because that really validates me putting this off until we could get you for enough time to really get into it. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Is It Bad for the Economy? Like we've been doing for our longer interviews, we're going to do it audio only. If it's just a Banker Bill and I news roundup, we'll keep doing video. So look out for that in 2 weeks. Please give us those 5-star reviews, those likes and shares and comments. Please share it with a family or friend. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it so much. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Happy to be here. I want to do it again. I love this.
We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time